That Halloween night in 1992 remains the scariest of my life. And mind you, I was always one of those fearless kids who loved horror stories and was always ready to push my limits. My best friend Sarah and I were bursting with excitement because it would be our first Halloween unsupervised. Lila and Sarah exploring the neighborhood like two big girls. I wore a witch's costume, a black dress with torn hems, and a pointed hat my mother found at a thrift store that had a faint scent of mothballs. Sarah looked flawless as an antique doll, her porcelain mask reflecting the light from the pumpkins and giving her a look that was both fascinating and unsettling. At each house, laughter and candy filled our bags, and the night felt like a dream, illuminated by carved pumpkins casting a flickering orange glow over the sidewalks. The air was cool, scented with dry leaves and the sweet smell of candy coming from the bags. It was a perfect scene, and we laughed at everything, driven by the thrill of being on our own. With every step, we felt that night was ours, an adventure without limits. But everything changed when we reached the end of Pine Street. A cold shiver ran down my spine, and it was as if someone had turned off the sound of the world around us. The laughter and rustle of leaves disappeared, replaced by a silence so dense it pressed the air against our ears. A thick fog, appearing out of nowhere, began to envelop the street, swallowing each streetlight and dulling the shadows of the houses. The cold seeped under my skin, sticking like a damp film. "Let's keep going," Sarah said, her voice vibrating with its usual determination. She never backed down even when fear whispered in our ears. She was the one who pointed to the house that everyone at school said was haunted, old Mr. Gale's mansion. The stories varied. Some said he died inside, others that he went mad and was never seen again. The facade of the house, even veiled by the fog, seemed to stare at us with its shattered windows, like weary eyes. I wanted to turn back, an alert sensation hammering in my head. But Sarah smiled, a playful challenge in her eyes. "If he has the best candy, it's worth it, don't you think?" she teased, and with one last nervous glance, I followed her steps. With Sarah's contagious bravery and my fear suppressed by a touch of curiosity, we approached the house. The mansion was everything the stories said. Huge, with peeling paint, forming patterns that looked like twisted faces and cracked windows that seemed like watchful eyes tracking our movements. Each step toward the house seemed to suck the sound out of the night. Even the crinkle of dry leaves underfoot became muffled, swallowed by the silence. Sarah climbed the porch steps without hesitation, and the loud creak of the wood echoed like a grim warning. The air smelled of dampness and mold, and a cold breeze seemed to blow under the door, sending a shiver down my spine. She raised her hand and knocked on the door, the sound echoing hollow and distant. We waited, the seconds stretching into what felt like minutes. No one answered. "Let's go in," Sarah said, a daring smile playing on her lips, the porch shadows casting lines of light across her face. With a firm push, the door creaked open, revealing a deep darkness and a thick smell, like something long forgotten by life's touch. As we stepped inside, the house's smell wrapped around us like a suffocating cloud, a mix of embedded mold and something sour, like rotting food left for too long. The air felt stagnant, dense, and heavy, as if no one had breathed there for years. The darkness was nearly complete, broken only by thin beams of streetlight filtering through cracks in the dusty windows. Sarah moved down the hallway with determined steps, the wooden floorboards groaning beneath her feet. "Let's explore," she said, her voice almost a whisper, but steady. I wanted out. My instinct screamed to run, but my body stayed glued to hers, the fear of separating stronger than any impulse to flee. We passed a cracked mirror on the wall, its dusty surface reflecting distorted shapes and shadows that didn't make sense. That's when a movement behind us caught my eye. My heart raced and I turned quickly, the sound of my own gasp trapped in my ears. But there was nothing there, only the dimness closing in around us as if waiting, patient. We crept down the hallway, our cautious steps muffled by the old wood and the heavy air surrounding us. A faint, flickering light came from the room at the end, casting shadows on the walls that seemed to shift on their own. They were candles, two, swaying softly, and the question carved itself into my mind. How could they be lit in a place that seemed forgotten by time? Sarah, her eyes glinting with challenge, murmured that we should check it out. I pushed the door slowly, and it groaned in protest, revealing a large, dusty parlor. At the center stood a table, as if time had stopped at an abandoned dinner. 2 cups and plates, their porcelain yellowed with age, and food that, though wilted and nearly rotted, was still recognizable. The air felt even colder there, a chill running down my spine. In the middle of one plate, an old, brittle piece of candy corn lay like a sinister reminder. It had a faintly opaque hue, as if it had been there for decades but still held its shape. It looked purposefully placed, waiting for someone brave enough to take it. That's when the radio in the room suddenly turned on, breaking the silence with a static hiss that made us jump. The sound pulsed through the room, echoing ominously and filling the space with an oppressive buzz. Sarah clutched her chest, eyes wide and breathing shallow. Before we could process what was happening, a rough, rasping voice emerged from the static, as if coming from somewhere far, somewhere it shouldn't be reached. "Lila, Sarah, good girls, so nice to see you here." The voice had a tone loaded with irony, as if an invisible smile hid behind the words. Each syllable dragged out with calculated malice, a sound that made my skin prickle and my blood run cold. My heart raced, pounding so hard it echoed in my head. I looked at Sarah, searching her face for confirmation that she too felt the urgency to leave. Her eyes were wide, breath trapped in shallow gasps, and at that moment, I realized that fear had finally reached her as well. We tried to run to the exit, but the door slammed shut behind us with a thud so loud it made my heart skip. The sound echoed throughout the room, heavy and relentless. We rushed to the door, yanking at the handle with all our strength, but it seemed welded to the frame. Sarah began pounding on the wood with her open palms, her screams blending with the sound of my own ragged breathing. My whole body shook, cold sweat trickling down my neck as I struggled to stay composed. That's when we heard it. Footsteps heavy and slow shuffling across the floor as if rising from a grave. The sound came from all directions, filling the room with a stifling presence. I turned slowly, the air around me feeling trapped, and saw a figure emerging from the darkness shaped by the shadows as if the room itself were forming it. He was tall and gaunt, with skin a ghostly white and eyes that were just empty hollows, dark pits that seemed to devour the light. He wore old, tattered clothes stained by time, but there was something terribly wrong with his movements. His arms and legs bent at angles that defied logic, as if his bones had been forced into impossible positions. The dry, subtle sound of something cracking accompanied his steps, and the air around him seemed to vibrate, as if space itself was contorting in his presence. Fear paralyzed me, my muscles rigid and breath caught in my throat as he advanced, his empty eyes fixed on us, unblinking. "Stay. A while," he whispered, and his voice echoed disturbingly, coming from all corners of the room, as if the walls themselves were repeating his words. The chilling sound ran down my spine like an electric current, and I knew that if we didn't get out of there, something terrible would happen. In a final act of desperation, Sarah and I pounded the door with all our might, our fists and palms stinging against the wood. The door shook under our blows, but it felt as though the very air was against us, pressing our bodies with an invisible weight. Sarah screamed, her voice cracked by panic, while I felt tears well up in my eyes, blurring my vision. Then suddenly the door gave way with a push, swinging open with a sharp creak. Without thinking, we bolted out, the sound of our footsteps echoing down the stairs like gunshots, our hearts pounding wildly. The feeling that something, or someone, was right behind us pushed us forward with each step, until we crossed the threshold and felt the cool night air on our faces, finally free from the house's oppression. We didn't dare look back as we ran, the terror clinging to us like a persistent shadow. We raced through the house as if our feet were propelled by fear itself until we finally reached the front door and flung it open. the night air flooding our lungs in an icy, refreshing rush. We stumbled out into the street, gasping for breath, as the door closed behind us with a final, resounding thud. Only then did we realize that the normal sounds of Halloween had returned. Children laughing, the rustle of leaves underfoot, the whisper of the wind. Sounds that for a moment had become impossible inside that house. Our hearts pounded in sync, and for a few seconds we stood there, breathing heavily and absorbing the shock. Everything felt surreal, as if the world around us had snapped back into its familiar place, but we remained out of step. I looked at Sarah, and she looked back, her eyes wide, still glistening with adrenaline and fear. We didn't need to say anything. Understanding passed between us in eloquent silence. It had been too real. The sour smell of the house, the whisper of that voice that echoed like a vivid nightmare. It couldn't have just been our imagination. The night air surrounded us, and for a brief moment I felt the comfort of being back in the normal world. But something in the air, a whisper of memory or a distant echo of static, made me wrap my arms around myself. I knew that night would stay with us forever, a dark reminder that some doors should never be opened. When we got home, we tried to tell our parents everything, the words tumbling out in rushed, broken phrases with the adrenaline still coursing through us. They listened with amused smiles, exchanging glances as if we were just stretching out some Halloween prank. My dad patted me on the back, chuckling. "It was just a Halloween scare, girls. These stories always seem more real on Halloween night, don't they?" he said, with a condescending twinkle in his eye. No one took us seriously, and even when we insisted, they shook their heads, saying that the house had been abandoned for years, that it was impossible for anything to be inside. The next day, after our stubborn insistence, our parents decided to visit the mansion to prove that nothing was there. We waited anxiously in the living room, time passing slowly, each minute more suffocating. When they returned, something had changed. They came in quietly, faces pale and eyes wide, without saying a word. My mother held her purse with trembling hands, and my father avoided our gaze, as if afraid to confirm what he had seen. "We found the table," he finally said, voice low and hollow. "The candy corn was there, and the radio, whispering just like you said." The silence that followed was so thick it felt palpable. The sound of the radio, a distant echo of something scratchy and rhythmic, seemed to cling to them, a reminder that the impossible is sometimes real. Since that night, no one dared go near Mr. Gale's mansion again. That experience etched itself in me like an invisible scar, and to this day I can remember every detail. The rancid smell in the air, the oppressive darkness that felt alive, and above all, the way he looked at us. His hollow eyes seemed to probe something beyond us, as if we were exactly where he wanted us, where he was waiting. For us. Neither Sarah nor I could forget. Time passed, but the memory lurked like a shadow. Sometimes on Halloween nights I wake up with a start, breath short and heart racing, with the sound of that rasping, low voice echoing in my head. "Lila, Sarah." It seems to come from every corner of the room, as if it's there, just beyond the door, whispering, waiting. On those nights, the darkness becomes oppressive again, and the weight of that memory clings to me, reminding me that some stories never truly leave us. No matter how much I try to tell myself it was all just a prank or a coincidence, there's something deep, an instinctive dread whispering that it was real. Whenever I see kids running from house to house, bags full of candy and innocent laughter, I feel a tightness in my chest, a restlessness that makes me hold my breath for a moment, wondering if any of them will ever dare challenge that house. I silently pray they won't. When Halloween night comes, I avoid Pine Street at all costs. Even after all these years, just thinking about passing by there makes a cold sweat break out on my neck and a shiver run down my spine. Because somewhere in my mind, I'm sure that if I get too close, I'll hear that radio static and those footsteps, heavy, dragging, following me again, as if time hadn't changed a thing and he were still waiting, just beyond the darkness. I always thought that Halloween night had a different energy, a mix of excitement and something dark that I couldn't quite explain, especially on that night in 1974. I was 8 years old, and to me, the world felt full of strange and delightful possibilities. My plan was simple: gather as many candies as possible alongside my older sister, Sarah. I was dressed as a skeleton, with ribs painted that glowed under the yellowish light of the street lamps. Sarah, maintaining the typical dignity of her 13 years, wore only a black cape that she herself called kind of plain. But that night, under the dancing shadows of the tall trees, her cape seemed to merge with the darkness. The streets of our small town in Texas were alive, filled with the laughter and hurried footsteps of costumed children, their voices echoing like fragmented whispers. The air was thick with the scent of sugar and dried leaves, and the occasional breeze brought a chill that I couldn't tell if it was from the cold or something deeper. At each house we filled our bags, the thank yous punctuated by our laughter, never thinking about what lay beyond the next door. But then we reached the end of the block. The night, which until then felt warm and full of life, seemed to shrink in on itself. We stopped in front of the house that all the kids avoided, the one they said was haunted. The dark windows watched us, empty, and I swear I felt a metallic taste in my mouth, as if something invisible was waiting. The house was a relic of the past, with broken shutters hanging like tired eyelids and a crooked fence, its boards peeling like skeletal fingers. Whenever I looked at that house, a chill ran down my spine, but strangely, a curiosity whispered to me, insistent. They said a widow lived there, a lady who simply disappeared one day, vanishing like a shadow at sunset. No one knew exactly what happened to her. That night, however, something was different. There was a dim light in the window, a flickering flame that seemed to dance, a pale golden reflection wavering as if meant to lure the unsuspecting. Maybe it was a candle or an old-fashioned lamp, but there, under the Halloween sky, it felt like a silent invitation. I tugged at Sarah's sleeve, the anxiety pulsing at my fingertips, and whispered that we should go over just to see what was happening. She hesitated, her eyes reflecting the distant lights of the street and something else, a glimmer of uncertainty, but she agreed with a sigh, as if resisting would be worse. As we started to approach, a strangeness filled the air. The laughter and voices of the other children seemed to dissolve in the distance, and the world closed in on us as if covered by a dome of silence. The leaves beneath our feet stopped crunching, and even the wind, which had previously brought us the distant rustling of the trees, quieted as if holding its breath. When we finally reached the door, a familiar chill ran down my neck, a mix of fear and adrenaline that made my heart pound against my ribs. Still, my trembling hand didn't hesitate to knock on the cold wood. Before I could pull back, the door creaked open by itself, in a slow movement that seemed to last an eternity. The sound echoed in the darkness, a sharp noise intertwining with the cold wind, as if the night itself was holding its breath to listen. The interior of the house was dimly lit by the faint light we had seen from afar. It flickered, an uncertain and wavering flame casting shadows that moved like dancing figures on the faded walls. The smell of old wood and dust filled my nostrils, and the air carried a coldness that seemed to penetrate to my bones. I looked at Sarah. Her eyes were wide, her lips slightly parted as if she was about to say something. I almost thought about turning back, about running back to the warmth and noise of the street. But then, a whisper that was barely more than a breath crossed the space between us. "Come in." The voice was low and drawn out, as if coming from far away, yet at the same time it felt close, whispered directly into our ears. My stomach twisted and my feet seemed glued to the ground. I felt an unbearable mix of terror and an insane curiosity pulling me forward, as if an invisible hand was gripping my chest and pushing me. Suddenly a hand appeared from inside the house, slow and almost theatrical. It was covered by a black leather glove which strangely contrasted with the stifling heat of that night. The glove seemed smooth, flawless, yet somehow wrong, as if it concealed something I didn't want to imagine. It held a handful of candies wrapped in papers that glimmered under the flickering light, reflecting shadows that moved on the wall like restless insects. We stood paralyzed, our hearts pounding in our chests, but something in the familiarity of the candies, perhaps the childish instinct not to waste a Halloween, made us extend our hands and take what was offered. The gesture was mechanical, a mix of impulse and the fear of looking foolish. As soon as our fingers touched the cold candies, the hand withdrew back into the shadows, without a sound. We tried to thank her, but our throats were dry. The words caught. We turned and stepped onto the wooden porch, eager to get out of there. It was then that the door slammed shut with a bang that sliced through the air. The impact was so strong it made our bodies jump, and I felt the ground vibrate beneath my feet as if the house itself was alive, pulsing with anger. I looked back and the house seemed to have changed. The shadows had thickened, gaining a depth that sucked in the light from the street. The air was colder, denser, as if we were submerged. In that moment I knew, with a chill running like ice down my spine, that something was terribly wrong with that house, something that wouldn't simply let us go. When we got home, the familiarity of the place couldn't erase the unsettling feeling still crawling through my mind. I tried to convince myself that it was just a strange Halloween night, nothing more. Sarah and I emptied our bags onto the living room floor, the crinkling of the candies falling echoing in an almost reassuring way. We began sorting our treasure, quietly laughing at some choices, but then something broke the rhythm. In the midst of the colorful wrappers and ordinary caramels, there was a small brown package, its surface stained and covered in a fine layer of dust. It was as if that item had been forgotten somewhere dark for years. I carefully picked up the package, feeling the roughness of the dry paper against my skin. I looked at Sarah, who returned my gaze with a curious and tense look, her brows furrowed in a worried line. We slowly opened the package, the folds of the paper cracking with resistance until revealing an old pendant. It was a locket, heavy and cold to the touch, with details reminiscent of filigree from a bygone era. In the center, a black and white photo of a woman. Her eyes were intense, so alive that they seemed ready to leap from the small space and fixate directly on us. She had a penetrating, challenging gaze that followed our movements. The edges of the photo were yellowed, and a slight crack ran through the contained smile on her lips, which seemed more like a warning than an expression of joy. The room, once filled with the cheerful noise of candies, sank into a heavy silence, and for a moment, the air felt denser, as if even the house was waiting to see what would happen next. At that moment, my mother walked through the living room, her steps slowing to a stop upon noticing what we held. Her expression changed in the blink of an eye, from casual curiosity to a rigidity I had never seen before. Her eyes fixed on the photo, and for a moment, I thought she might faint. The room seemed to hold its breath along with her. Where did you find this?" Her voice came out as a nearly inaudible thread, and she seemed to be struggling against some buried memory. I asked if she knew the woman, and despite shaking her head at first, I saw the hesitation in her eyes, the shadow of a fear that made her strangely vulnerable. "That's Mrs. Thompson," she finally said, the name escaping like a heavy whisper. "She lived in that house, but she disappeared many years ago." Her voice carried a tremor we had never heard, and it sent a shiver spreading across my skin. My mother, who always scoffed at horror stories and laughed at gossip about quirky neighbors, now seemed small in the presence of the locket. The object in my hands suddenly felt heavier, as if it wanted to stay there, stuck. The woman's gaze in the photo, so intensely focused, seemed to follow us with every move. I turned the locket back and forth, but her eyes never lost their focus. They had a depth that made me feel watched, exposed. The room was so silent that the ticking of the clock sounded like a drum in the distance, each second dragging as if it knew we were on the brink of something we couldn't undo. After a few minutes of dense silence, my mother decided that we couldn't keep the locket at home. Her discomfort was evident, her restless gaze averted from the photo every time it passed over us, as if something in it confronted her personally. The next morning, we got into the car, the tension hanging between us like a heavy cloud. The trip to the house at the end of the block was silent, marked only by the sound of the engine and the occasional crack of the dashboard. When we stopped, the house looked even more abandoned than the night before, its weathered boards covered in moss and cracks that stretched like scars. No movement, no light, just the thick and motionless quiet that surrounded us. The wind passed gently, but there was a sound in it, something like a distant sigh. We stood on the sidewalk for what felt like an eternity. I could feel my heart pounding in my ears and my hands were cold and clammy. My mother took a deep breath, her trembling hand closing around the locket before approaching the door. She raised her hand and knocked 3 times, each knock echoing like a hammer in a place that should have been dead. Nothing. The silence swallowed the sound again, more oppressive than before. The air around us seemed to have a different density, as if we were in a bubble that trapped every sound and breath. It was a silence that made the skin crawl, an invisible weight pressing on my chest. Even without any sign of life, the house seemed to be watching us, an invisible and ancient presence lurking in the shadows and emptiness. When my mother finally gave up and we turned to leave, an almost palpable tension hung over us. The air felt colder, denser, and my footsteps sounded muffled on the gravel path. Suddenly, I felt an urgent touch on my arm. It was Sarah, nudging me with wide eyes and pointing to the window of the house. There, where we had seen the light on Halloween night, a flame flickered once more. Weak, unstable, its orange glow cast restless shadows against the foggy glass, as if something was moving behind it. A shiver ran down my spine, and my heart raced as if trying to escape my chest. Time seemed to stop as we watched that flame that shouldn't be there. My mother saw it too. For a moment she froze, her lips parted and her eyes fixed on the window, as if waiting for something else to appear. But then, in a burst of instinct, she pulled us hard, holding our hands tightly as if afraid that if we let go, we would be drawn back into that house. The air around us seemed to pulse, oppressive, almost suffocating. The feeling of being watched didn't dissipate. On the contrary, it seemed to grow with each step we took away. Even as we walked down the sidewalk and the house receded behind us, I felt an invisible weight on my back. A pair of ancient, relentless eyes following us with an intensity that made my skin crawl. On the way home, no one talked much about what happened. The air was heavy, as if the house itself had absorbed some of the fear we brought with us. It was as if the presence of the locket, though physically absent, was still there, lingering in every corner of the room. In the days that followed, I tried to convince myself that it was all just a coincidence, perhaps an elaborate Halloween prank that was beyond our understanding. But the fragile calm I had managed to build shattered the next night. When I went to check my bag of candies, my heart froze. There, tossed at the bottom, lay the locket gleaming under the yellowish light of the lamp. It seemed impossible, a delusion of my mind, but it was real. The locket looked different, dustier, with a patina that hadn't been there before. Tiny cracks ran through the metal as if time had passed too quickly for it. I called for my mother, my voice caught in my throat, and when she appeared, her eyes fixed on the piece as if she were witnessing a nightmare taking shape. The silence between us was so thick that the sound of our breathing echoed. She said nothing. She just looked at me, a mix of fear and helplessness etched on her face. We both knew we had left the locket in that house. There was no logic to its return. But it was there, and it carried with it a dark sensation, as if with each passing second, something invisible and hostile was drawing closer. From that moment on, small things began to happen at home, but each one seemed to carry a disproportionate weight. The lights would suddenly flicker, casting the room into a frantic dance of shadows and flashes, as if something was playing with the switch. There was a creak in the floorboards, a dry sound echoing like soft footsteps when no one was around. Objects I was sure I had left in a specific place appeared elsewhere, as if moved by invisible hands. And the feeling of being watched intensified, a silent presence that made me glance over my shoulder with a desperate frequency. I avoided looking at the locket, but it felt as if it had consciousness. I could swear that even with my back turned, I felt its presence piercing me with a cold weight. My mother, who always tried to remain calm, attempted to throw the locket away once more. The sound of the trash can lid closing resonated like a momentary relief, but the peace was short-lived. The next morning, the locket was back, resting in the same spot in the living room, dusty and unchanged, as if something was challenging us. The situation reached a point where we avoided talking about it. The words seemed to hold power, and silence became an involuntary pact. As if by ignoring it, we could fend off the fear that slowly infiltrated every room. But nothing changed. The air in the house grew heavier, carrying a strange smell of dampness and something metallic that we couldn't identify. The atmosphere was suffocating, and the tension was palpable, squeezing our chests like an invisible hand. Something was there, and it seemed to want us to know it, even if we didn't have the courage to admit it out loud. One night, I woke up with a sensation that made me hold my breath, a chill that seemed to spring from my bones and spread throughout the room. The darkness around me was almost solid, but there was something more in it. In the corner of the room, a shadow loomed, tall and motionless. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was dense, with a presence that seemed to absorb the little glow the moon cast through the window cracks. It felt as if it were watching me, without eyes, but with an intention I could sense on my skin. I closed my eyes, my body rigid with fear, every muscle paralyzed by terror. My heart beat so loudly that it was the only thing I could hear, hammering in a chaotic rhythm. I waited, mentally counting, each second dragging on like an eternity. When I finally gathered the courage to open my eyes, the shadow was closer, so close that it seemed about to project itself onto me. The air was sharp, and the silence was almost painful. I felt cold sweat trickling down my neck, each drop a testament to the terror that overtook me. I squeezed my eyes shut, repeating to myself that it was just a dream, that soon reality would return to normal. But when I opened my eyes one last time, the room was empty. The shadow had vanished. But the relief was brief. On the floor at the foot of my bed, the locket lay, inert and cold, reflecting the pale light of the moon. It seemed darker, the cracks in its surface deeper, and a feeling that it would never leave us took hold of me. The next day I told my mother about what had happened during the night. Her eyes widened and she nervously ran her hand through her hair, a gesture she always made when on the brink of panic. Even so, she tried to stay calm. "Maybe we can take this to a church," she suggested, her voice low and trembling, as if fearing that something might hear her. It was an attempt to ward off whatever was haunting us. But when we went to look for the locket, it had disappeared. We searched every corner of the house, rummaging through drawers, shelves, and even the old toolbox in the basement. Nothing. It was as if the locket had turned to dust, or as if an invisible hand had taken it back to where it came from. In the following days, something changed. The house, once shrouded in an oppressive weight, began to feel lighter. The air lost that strange density, and the shadows returned to being just shadows. Little by little, the fear dissipated, although it never truly left us. A remnant of what we experienced lingered with us, like a silent shadow in the mind. Years passed, and although life moved on, neither of us could forget what happened on that Halloween night. The memory of the locket and the shadow at the edge of the bed visited us at the most unexpected moments, reminding us that the inexplicable can be lurking where we least expect it. As for the house at the end of the block, it remained there, still and forgotten, like a scar on the fabric of the neighborhood. No one spoke of it anymore, and over time, the children who had grown up with us either moved away or simply learned to ignore it. But sometimes, when night fell and the wind whispered through the trees, I could swear I saw a faint light flickering in the window, as if warning us that the past never truly leaves us. After that night, we tried to return to our routines, filling our days with ordinary activities to distract us from what happened. But whenever I passed by the house at the end of the block, a chill crept down my spine, like invisible fingers. It was impossible to ignore the heavy memory of what we lived there. The house remained empty and silent, its dark windows watching like emotionless eyes, giving no sign that anyone cared for it. It was as if it were waiting, anticipating a new moment to manifest. Some neighbors began to whisper that they had never seen any light on that Halloween night. They smiled in disbelief, commenting that stories like that always arise when the wind blows darker. "Child's play," they said with muffled laughs, unaware that their skepticism only isolated us further. But I knew what my sister and I had seen, and what my mother felt when she faced the photo in the locket. That gaze still followed me, even in the most unexpected moments. Sometimes the woman's face would appear in my dreams, a specter with intense eyes emerging from the darkness, always motionless but laden with a veiled threat. I would wake up with my heart racing, the room enveloped in shadows that seemed alive for a moment until I regained my senses and remembered I was safe. But safety was a thin, fragile illusion. The house at the end of the block continued to stand as a forgotten landmark, ignored by most, but always there, like a scar left by a wound that never fully heals. And on silent nights, when the moon barely peeked through the clouds and the wind blew with a long, restless whisper, I could swear that a faint light flickered in its window, a silent reminder that the past never truly leaves us. To this day, the feeling of being watched that night still lingers in me like a persistent shadow. The image of the figure standing in the corner of the room visits me in moments of silence, like a whispering echo that never fades. I don't know exactly what it was, but I am certain that something out of the ordinary was tied to that locket and that house. It was more than just a coincidence. It was an invisible weight, a part of what happened that still resides within me, even after all these years. Whenever I tell this story, I feel a shiver run across my skin, reliving the cold hours and the fixed gaze of that woman in the photo. Her expression was so vivid, so charged with something that made me feel small and exposed. And although I have never seen the locket again, it's as if it still exists somewhere, ingrained in me in a way I cannot explain. Sometimes, on windless nights, I feel a heaviness in the air, as if something is near, watching and waiting. Since that Halloween, I've avoided passing by the end of the block. The house, still and always empty, has become an ignored part of the neighborhood, but no one dares to knock on that door anymore. The children who grew up hearing whispers about what happened there hurry past the place, and even the adults avoid lingering glances. The house remains a mute reminder, a forgotten presence that, in some way, everyone acknowledges, even if they never speak of it. And on nights when the silence becomes oppressive, it seems that the past still breathes, reminding me that some stories never fully close. My name is Kevin, and I never imagined that one day I would be telling this. Some things just follow you, haunting you for a lifetime. It was Halloween of 1984. I was 15 years old and lived in the quiet town of Braxton, where everyone knew everything, and horror stories were just stories. But that night, my friends Samantha, Ryan, and I decided to test our courage. We were inseparable, and like any teenager who thinks they're invincible but is afraid to admit it, we were looking for a good challenge. The night air was cold, carrying the sweet scent of dry leaves and brown sugar, while the laughter of children in costumes echoed through the streets. But there was one house that no one dared to cross, not even to look at for too long: the old mansion at the end of Willow Lane. They talked about the boy who disappeared there, on the same Halloween, years before. Just a legend, right? That's what we wanted to believe. As we approached, I felt the weight of the night change. The initial excitement gave way to a growing discomfort, a kind of silent alert pulsing in my temples. I remember looking at Samantha. She was still smiling, but her hands were trembling, gripping the flashlight so tightly that her fingers were pale. The house seemed to have been forgotten by time, with its shattered windows and peeling paint hanging like flaking skin. It had an air of anticipation, as if it were more than just a place, as if it were a being waiting. The silence around was heavy, thick, so absolute that my own footsteps sounded like echoes within me. The door, large and solid, creaked open with a groan that lingered in the cold, damp air, sending a shiver down my spine like an icy hand. The smell inside was of mold, but there was something else, a stench that spoke of death, of abandonment. I exchanged a quick glance with Ryan and noticed that even he, always so skeptical, was breathing shallowly. We moved forward, each step taking us deeper into what felt like the beginning of a nightmare. With Samantha's flashlight cutting through the darkness, we moved down the narrow hallway, wrapped in shadows and accompanied by the creaking sound of the wooden floor beneath each step. The echo reverberated off the peeling walls, feeding the unsettling feeling that something was watching us, lurking behind the cracked plaster. The furniture, covered in a thick layer of dust, appeared as indistinct shapes, like forgotten figures in an ancient gloom. The air was filled with a sharp smell of rotting wood and old wax like candles long extinguished, suffocating our senses. A movement to the right caught our attention. A nearly disintegrated jack-o'-lantern sat on a small table, its shrunken, brittle shell still carved with a crooked, defiant grin. Samantha tried to lighten the mood with a nervous joke about cheap horror movies, but her voice sounded weak, dispersing without an echo. No one laughed. The truth was, the silence that followed told us everything. Something was wrong. Very wrong. We walked in silence, our eyes sweeping the darkness ahead, until a partially open door appeared at the end of the hallway. The faint light revealed a wooden rocking chair turned toward the window, cloaked in shadow. Ryan, always the first to act, stepped forward with a smile that didn't reach his eyes and motioned us over, pointing at the chair. It rocked gently, almost imperceptibly, as if someone had just stood up. The air around us grew denser, cold enough to raise goosebumps. "Let's see if it's really that special," Ryan said, his voice steadier than the moment called for, and he sat down. The chair groaned under his weight, and that was when the temperature plummeted, as if a door to winter had swung open. The cold seeped into our bones, and then the sound came. A child's laugh, distant, hoarse, and drawn out, pierced the air. It felt as if a child were mocking our presence, testing our resolve. Our eyes met, wide and reflecting the same muted terror, as the laughter echoed and slowly faded, like a whispered threat aimed at us. The laughter was quiet, but unmistakably childlike, echoing down the hallway like a whispered secret. Samantha gripped my hand tightly, her fingers cold and trembling. The beam from the flashlight began to flicker, casting dancing shadows on the walls, shapes that seemed to move and stare back at us. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would leap from my chest. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure in the doorway through which we had entered. At first I thought it was just a poorly formed shadow, but the outlines were clear. A boy, small, no older than 10, with hollow, lifeless eyes, staring at a distant point that seemed beyond us. As if seeing something we couldn't, he stood completely still, and when the faltering light of the flashlight passed over his pale, gaunt face, a visceral fear gripped me. It was as if the air around me clung to my skin, suffocating. I tried to move, but my feet felt glued to the floor, heavy as lead. Samantha let out a choked sob, her breath turning into short, frantic gasps. The boy raised his hand, slowly, the movement so deliberate it felt wrong, almost inhuman. He pointed to the floor, and my stomach turned when I realized what he wanted us to see, the jack-o'-lantern in the other room. His expression held a sorrow so deep it almost seemed human, almost as if he were pleading for help. A wave of cold swept through the hallway, thick and filled with a crushing weight. My vision began to blur and I felt hot, inexplicable tears streaming down my face. Samantha let out a low moan, more a whisper than a scream, as the boy stepped back, swallowed by the darkness. In an instant he was gone, as if he had never been there. It was the spark we needed. Panic erupted in our bodies. Ryan muttered a muffled curse, and without thinking we turned and ran for the exit. The sound of our footsteps echoed down the hallway and none of us dared to look back, driven forward by the sheer will to escape. We stumbled out of the house, tripping over each other, propelled by an almost desperate urgency. The adrenaline still surged through my veins as we ran, our ragged breaths mingling with the creaking wood, as if the house itself were alive and protesting our departure. The cool night air hit us as we crossed the doorway, a chilling shock against our flushed skin. We didn't stop until we reached the main street, where the heavy silence surrounded us, and the distance between us and the house finally felt safe. Samantha's flashlight flickered like a final breath before going out with a snap. We stood still, absorbing the sudden darkness. The silence was oppressive, each of us trapped in thoughts we didn't want to voice. What we had seen was impossible to ignore. Ryan was the first to speak, his voice a bit too loud as if trying to force normalcy. "Someone just wanted to scare us. It must have been a bad joke, you know. Maybe an adult," he said, rubbing his neck, but the doubt was clear in his eyes. Samantha stared at the ground, her shoulders still tense. I knew she felt the same as I did, the distant laughter, the boy's hollow stare, the icy chill that seeped under the skin. None of it was an act. The image of the boy haunted me, his eyes fixed on a point beyond us, as if he were lost in another time. A shiver ran down my spine as the connection clicked in my mind. Tom Hollis, the missing boy. The thought left a knot in my chest, a suffocating mix of pity and fear. It wasn't a mischievous spirit. It was a trapped presence, waiting for something that never came. I stood there, unable to speak, as the cold night wind seemed to whisper secrets no one wanted to hear. In the days that followed, we did everything we could to avoid the topic, but the silence gnawed at us from within. Every creak, every shadow at nightfall seemed to transport us back to that house, as if the boy were still there, watching us, waiting for us to do something. Samantha, in a moment of exhaustion, finally broke the silence. "I dream about him. Tom's face, those eyes, and the hand pointing at the jack-o'-lantern," she said, her voice trembling and low. The meaning of it all eluded us, but the weight of his sadness still lingered over us. That's why we decided to go back in the daylight, searching for answers. The thought of entering that house again made our stomachs churn, but there was something stronger than fear. An unpaid debt to the boy. In the sunlight, the house looked almost ordinary, a faded shadow of the terror it had been. But something was different. The jack-o'-lantern we saw in the room was gone. We searched every corner, eyes sharp for any sign, but it was as if it had vanished along with the boy. In its place, only a mark remained on the floor, as if something had been dragged away. A deep emptiness settled over me, the feeling that we would never find answers. Maybe some things weren't meant to be understood. We left in silence with the strange conviction that somehow the boy had found peace. We made a silent promise never to return, but we knew that night would follow us forever. The years passed, and each of us went our separate ways. But the memory of that house and that boy continued to haunt us, like the echo of something unfinished. Sometimes, I would wake up in the middle of the night, the image of Tom's empty stare still etched in my mind, a gaze that transcended time and space. Years later, during a conversation among friends, Ryan admitted, in a low voice with his head bowed, that he still wondered if we could have done more. Samantha, on the other hand, confessed that she believed Tom just wanted someone to know his story, for his disappearance not to be just another forgotten rumor in the town's past. That idea stayed with me, took root. It was a reminder that even when stories seem to end, they continue within those who lived them. Today, whenever I pass by Willow Lane, I avoid looking toward the end of the street where the old mansion still stands, now covered in ivy and shadows from the trees that have grown around it. No one dares to cross the gate, especially on Halloween. I prefer it that way. The house seems to rest in silence, an ambiguous peace, as if it has finally found rest, something Tom never knew in life. But deep down, I know he's still there, in some way, waiting. Maybe for someone who can understand his pain. Maybe just watching, silently, those who dare to come near. Some stories, after all, never truly end. They whisper, always lurking, waiting for the next curious soul brave enough to listen.